Hi, welcome back to episode 4, I think. I came up with this clickbaity title, which I might not be able to live up to, the Beastie Boys and beat poetry. But I mostly came up with it because I'm working on a story inspired by the Beastie Boys album, Ill Communications. It was a challenge from my friend Adam. I'm writing 20 stories based on prompts people give me. And one of them was to write a story based on an album. We came up with Ill Communications through discussion. But I also was trying to memorize part of it for a local reading. And that reminded me of all of these issues that I'm interested in talking about with prose. Prose is just one of my obsessions. I'm not an expert on poetry, really. I don't write poetry at all, really. But I have this obsession with prose that studying poetry, at least, gives me some perspective on. There are a lot of basic misconceptions with prose that link up with what I was saying in previous episodes. For my longtime loyal viewers, the main one is having to do with really the center. This is Bo. First time viewers, by the way, this is my co-host, Bo, who's always on my lap. But the main one has to do with right here, the center of the circle. The center of the rainbow circle. That sounds like a title. I'll stay on track, I swear. But some common misconceptions when it comes to prose. I just accidentally slipped into iambic there. But some common misconceptions when it comes to prose. A lot of the times when people teach the best ways to write prose, a lot of the times they'll rely on these sort of cliche bits of advice or things that are taboo. And these are the false universals. That was my last video, was primarily about these false universals that people disseminate as always being true. For example, never use passive voice, never use adverbs, that sort of thing. But what I would say as a counterpoint to that is that euphony can be as powerful as word choice. So the sound of a word can be as powerful as the meaning of the word. And the way that relates to, the way that relates to the center of the rainbow circle, the center is the visceral stimulation, the churning chaos of the visceral stimulation, that the undifferentiated tissue, as Burroughs would call it, that can turn into anything. So the stimulation at the core can be irrational. It doesn't have to actually mean anything at all. Can you believe that? It doesn't have to actually mean anything at all. So you can have stimulation based on purely irrational sounds. You could have stimulation based on purely irrational, this is Maggie, my other co-host, stimulation based on purely irrational colors, for example. So the rainbow circle partly was inspired by abstract expressionism. I talk a lot about my Mark Rothko obsession. Maybe I'll make a video about that. This is inspired by Jasper Johns and a lot of other artists who did that sort of circle design. Joseph Albers, for example. Joseph Albers did that design. So if a color can inspire irrational stimulation, the combination of sounds can inspire irrational stimulation. And so if you look at poetic experiments by Kurt Schwitters and that sort of thing, the combination of sounds can form a poem, whether or not they actually combine for actual words, or sound poetry. The precursor to Daniel Carmes and O'Barry, that whole group. I don't know if I'm pronouncing any of these things correctly. I read things without hearing them most of the time. So if I mispronounce them, so what? O'Barry, O-B-E-R-I, oh wait, hold on. Ober. Dang, I forgot how to spell it. But anyway, so the whole idea of like Zaum poetry, Zaum, is irrational combinations of sounds that elicit visceral responses. Daniel Carms and all of his group came along, and it was similar in that it was the irrational combination of story elements that shift in unexpected directions and create simulation despite the irrationality. Taking a story apart and rebuilding it. And so you could apply that to music. I don't know much about music at all. I'm not an expert on music in the least degree. Stories, poetry, music is way down there in terms of expertise. But if you listen to a song, the voice works. There you go. The voice works as much. The combination of sounds of the voice work as much as an instrument as they do as a purveyor of meaning through the words. And it differs depending on what type of music you're talking about. So my father used to always complain about music these days. You can't even understand the lyrics, and he liked country music. Country music tends to be more storytelling based. The values in the clarity of the words. So for country music, conveying a particular meaning is more significant than other types of music. Other types of music, the voice functions as a melodic instrument. A lot of pop music, a lot of other types of music function as a melodic instrument. Country music and show tunes, it's a storytelling device. With hip hop, it tends to be a percussive instrument, but there is also a heavy emphasis on wordplay. There is a heavy emphasis on combinations of images and ideas to pop the crowd. Usually, it's designed for public performances. It's designed to pop the crowd. And pop the crowd is a wrestling term, but it functions essentially the same way. If you think of a wrestling promo, there's no real premium on making sense, but it will have these little moments of causing the crowd to cheer and excitement and what have you. That comes from clever combinations of words, really clever references. Cleverness is much more of a premium in hip-hop than it is in pop music or something like that, where a lot of real basic pop songs, the voice really just functions as this melodic instrument. So in hip-hop, it's functioning as this percussive instrument and as Siku, of course, the center of the video, always. But anyway, it's functioning as this percussive instrument much more so than pop music. So and that's where the combination comes for between beat poetry and hip hop just generally. I'm not a hip hop expert. I am not very cool at all. This is why I picked Beastie Boys over other hip hop groups, because when I was talking to Adam about the album to inspire me, I said, if you did like a Wu-Tang Clan album or something like that, you could write a whole very densely complicated novel inspired by that. But I'm not cool enough to actually pull that off. So I'm still not cool enough to pull off Beastie Boys, but a little closer to being that level of cool. They're very nerdy. So I could be that variety of nerdy. But it still functions percussively, and that's a lot of beat poetry will function that way. Beat prose too. I'll wrap Kerouac up in that as well. And I was reminded of Kerouac a couple of different ways lately. A lovely and wonderful poet named P.W. Covington gave me a bumper sticker that said God is Pooh Bear. So I had to explain to my son, it was kind of a complicated explanation, my 7-year-old son, what God is Pooh Bear means. And so as I was trying to explain it, I said, that's from a great book called On the Road. It's from the ending of it. And I quoted a bit. In America, when the sun goes down, and I sit on the, I'm going to misquote it, I'm sure. I memorized it a long, long time ago, but I don't remember all of it. In America, when the sun goes down, and I sit on those long New Jersey piers, and sense all that raw land that rolls in one unbelievable huge bulge over to the west coast, and all that road going, and all the people dreaming in the immensity of it. And in Iowa, I know by now the children must be crying in the land where they let the children cry. Something, and don't you know that God is Pooh Bear? Can you believe that, Maggie? Don't you know that God is Pooh Bear? And so, a lot of the whole idea of beat poetry, that a lot of it is tied up in that whole concept of the word beat. And it really has two significant meanings that are really helpful for any sort of writer to really think of prose in this way. One of them is the beat, and Kerouac was very inspired by jazz music, of course. And a lot of people will say he imitates the syncopated rhythm of jazz. I don't know enough about music to really explain what that means, but I have a way I think of syncopated rhythm. There's Bo again. I have a way I think of syncopated rhythm. A lot of terminology I use for prose is probably deeply inaccurate. Because when I actually practice and I drill myself to get better and better, I tend to break it down in iambic and anapestic rhythm. I know that's probably totally wrong. But another way I break it down is as waltz rhythm and march rhythm, march and waltz rhythm. I call it iambic. That's one type of rhythm. And hold on. The claws are inside. The claws are hurting. Okay. This is turning into a comedy, of course. Are you done? Okay. And they're tearing something up right outside. Hold on. Okay. Okay. Nothing important. Okay. What was that? But so, the way I define syncopated rhythm in terms of prose, I know it's inaccurate to music, but this is how I define it in terms of prose. Switching from that waltz rhythm to the march rhythm. And Allen Ginsberg had a lot to say about these traditional concepts. Yes, I see you. I love you too. Ginsberg had a lot to say about these traditional ideas of poetic meter. Because he was fighting against a resurgence of formalism. And so if you look at a lot of the fight that he had with the acceptance of his poetry, a lot of it had to do with just this claim that it was formless. Because there was a renewed interest in things like iambic pentameter, or iambic meter, and anapestic meter, or whatever other types of meter. And so you would have people arguing that one of his professors, I forget which one, argued at Columbia University, or wherever. I'm probably butchering the history, and I'm sorry, but argued that iambic meter was the natural meter of the human voice. And he had William Carlos Williams, who was his mentor, arguing that sorry, I have dogs fighting right here. Let me concentrate. With dogs fighting right below me. William Carlos Williams arguing that in such form perfection is base, like some sort of quote like that. Perfection is basic and he's not perfect. So he would argue that, let's say iambic is not is a very limited sort of standard to have in poetry. They're gonna knock everything down. Stop. Stop. I'm trying to do something here. Stop. God. Okay. While I'm doing this, the whole room's gonna fall apart because the animals want my attention. What was that? Are you done? Are you done? Okay. But anyway, so we would argue that having such really strict poetic was not necessary. That's the sort of thing, at that time it was going back and forth. The modernists broke from that. There was a resurgence of that. The beats broke from that. So it was, sort of a back and forth pull. But that's, an example of kind of what I was talking about last time, the way a lot of these false universals, these cliches come into existence, is through common practices being mistaken for universal rules. So good poetry, on the most basic level, good poetry must rhyme, or good poetry must have this poetic meter, or what have you, which is clearly not true, but it becomes entrenched and it becomes a rule through common practice. That's not to say poetic meter creates bad poetry. There's plenty of good poetry, but it's just to say it's not a universal rule. But you could still detect the sort of iambic and anapestic rhythm, as I call it. It's probably not accurate. Iambic, of course, is the most commonly known one from Shakespeare. The example I always use is she walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and I sometimes call that march rhythm because it's anapestic. I use anapestic just because that's the one Dr. Seuss uses. I mentioned Horton Hears Who on the 14th of May in the jungle of Newell. It's two unstressed syllables followed by a stressed syllable. So what I call syncopated rhythm is in a Kerouac line or a Ginsberg line, where they go from this highly percussive anapestic to iambic rhythm. In the land where they let the children cry, and in Iowa, I know by now, the children must be crying. In the land where they let the children cry. So in Iowa, I know by now, you go from that march rhythm. In the land where they let the children cry. So he's sort of going back and forth between that iambic and between that march and waltz rhythm. That's just a way of really breaking it down. But it's Kerouac highly inspired by bop jazz. I don't know really anything about jazz except through beat poetry. Bop was, highly rhythmic, but not, it would switch up the rhythm quite frequently. But the other interpretation of the beat part of it, according to Kerouac, was the combination of beatific, Maggie sees me in the camera and sees me in real life. That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense. Do you see yourself? Do you see yourself? What is that? What is even happening right now? There's two of me. I guess that's what she sees. I don't know. Beatific meaning holy, and beat being the jazz lingo for beaten down, poor, what have you. And so the combination of those, that sort of juxtaposition, is one of the definitive central things that really defines that basic term of beat. And Ginsberg further systematized this into the whole idea of the eyeball kick. And the eyeball kick is a combination of things that don't really seem to go together without an expressly stated connection. And the really essential beat version of that is to connect something that's really mundane with something that's sacred or holy, what have you. And a technical word for that would be parataxis, and sometimes I use that as shorthand. But parataxis, you have a bunch of different types of parataxis. You have the imagist parataxis, and a lot of them really depend on the mood you're trying to create. So imagist parataxis creates this sort of, usually, not always, but it's a combination of things that could belong together, and the absence of the directly stated connection creates this sense of mystery to it. So it would be the red wheelbarrow plays with rainwater beside the white chickens. Rainwater, white chickens, red wheelbarrow, all that sort of stuff. They could be together, but you don't state why they're in juxtaposition. Apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on wet black bough. That's Ezra Pound, classic example of imagist parataxis. Why are they, all of these things together? It creates this sense of mystery. So it creates creates a whole set of emotions and responses and what have you. You also have surrealist parataxis. I didn't do this on purpose, but one of my surrealist books right there. You have surrealist parataxis that creates this disquieting, unsettling, uncanny effect. I had another great clickbaity line that I wanted to use for something. Like all art is surrealism. There's an argument there. That's a complicated argument, but surrealism is the basic art. But that's for another day. But so that's surrealist parataxis. Like the example I always use is Garcia Lorca saying Walt Whitman's beard was full of butterflies. Just as an example, beard full of butterflies. Have you ever heard of such a thing? Maggie's down here now. Yes, I said your name. So a beard and butterflies, that doesn't go together. It creates this dreamlike effect. And that's surrealist parataxis. Ginsberg boiled that down to the eyeball kick, and he was studying Cezanne painting, so he was studying visual art, the juxtaposition of two different colors, on that really basic level, causes the eyeball to kick. So the example he would always use is the crack of doom on the hydrogen jukebox. So there's that really percussive rhythm, mixes up the march rhythm and the waltz rhythm, but also the crowd popping lines of the juxtaposition of two things that seemingly don't belong together. So the combination of those things, it's hard to really define necessarily what beat poetry is, but the combination of all of those things together are really definitive of beat poetry. And you see a lot of examples of that, especially in hip-hop. You don't see it quite as much in other types of music where there's maybe a through line, a single story or what have you. Of course, there's plenty of hip-hop songs that are single stories, not to say that, but that sort of mix of paratactical lines, references to pop culture, that what I call syncopated rhythm of mixing up those sorts of poetic meters. Really, a lot of that is directly similar to beat poetry, and it's not a coincidence, really. I mean, there's a lot of direct influence, of course, but it's designed for live performance. So it's designed for, it's essentially both types are types of poetry designed to, perform live. They're very language driven, more so than driven purely by the music itself that backs it. And so, it's not a coincidental combination. And so, with Ginsberg especially, I have one one of my favorite books. I have been trying to connect different lines to different things I've written. I set these goals. Here's another group, Olipo. I set these Olipo-like goals, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I set these Olipo-like goals just to challenge myself. Because I really wanted my creative writing education to be much more challenging than it was. I look at things like Whiplash, and I say, "Oh, if only it had been more like Whiplash." Or Black Swan. I've been thinking of talking about Darren Aronofsky movies. But I look at Black Swan and I say, if only my creative writing education had been more like Black Swan, for whatever. But I set these Olipo-like challenges for myself. So I try to connect everything I write to different lines. If you see, these are, notations of the different lines from Howl that I've used to connect with different stories. But I have a novel called Jelly Halo, which I connect with one of my favorite lines. Jelly Halo is not one of my favorite novels that I've written, but it's one of my favorite lines. Who broke down crying in white gymnasiums, naked and trembling before the machinery of other skeletons. So, but you can see that all of those different elements, that really percussive sort of mix of metrical feet with the parataxis, the machinery of other skeletons. That's just one of my favorite lines from Howl. Machinery of other skeletons. It has that, that waltz rhythm right there at the end. And then, really percussive sort of consonants on each beat. But the project that I'm using for the Beastie Boys story, it's called the Opal Bean War. It's ongoing. This is not finished yet. I may never be finished with it. I don't know. We'll see. But the line I used for that one, line 64, I just decided on this one the other day. Who retired to Mexico to cultivate a habit, or Rocky Mountain to Tenor Buddha, or Tangiers to boys, or Harvard. Oh, it's been a while since I've memorized all these. Or South Pacific to the Black Locomotive, or Harvard, or Narcissus to Woodlawn, or the Daisy Chain of Grey. And that's a piling on of a lot of different images. Just, piling them on top of each other in this sequence, which is a technique he got from Walt Whitman, of course. But it's that sort of sequencing of lines that you see commonly in hip-hop, where it'll just pile up a lot of different references, a lot of different images, without necessarily connecting it, parataxis after parataxis. And parataxis doesn't have to be just two things connected with each other. It could be a piling, it could be a catalog. There's another line from Howl, who ran through the icy streets, obsessed with the sudden alchemy of the use of the ellipse to catalog the variable measure in the vibrating plane. So the vibrating plane is the combination of images that don't, the eyeball cut, the combination of images that don't seem to belong together, creates a vibrating plane. But the catalog, that's what I got from Whitman, but it's the, taking parataxis and continuing on with that line. And so, you can see that just in any sort of hip-hop, certainly in ill communications. So if you think of any sort of, I'm trying, now that I'm blanking on the lyrics, I mean, like an example like Root Down. Root Down is one that I would teach that one in composition classes, because sometimes I used to, really early when I started teaching composition, because I asked people, what do you think they're trying to communicate? And they talk about a lot of these connections with old school hip hop and the root idea. And a lot of them would say they're trying to prove themselves because they're white. but this was in the 90s, so I sort of flipped that around and said, Root Down was connecting back to the roots of hip-hop in the 80s, trying to prove that there's value in this older form because it was changing with, all these different changes in hip-hop at the time. But that's the meaning of it. Ultimately, the value arguably is in the much more particulate level of the rhythm of it creating this visceral impact, the rhythm of the words and of the beats in direct combination, with the sequence of images that also elicit visceral responses. So the combination of all those things, and the meaning is another, just another layer to it. It's not the sole value of it. It's all of these different things layered on top of each other. So, they would pile up references like Sweeney Pied by the Stone Alliance. Everybody knows I'm known for dropping science. Some electric like to Hyman, guess you'd expect to catch the crew rhyming. Never let you down with the stereo sound. I'm not going to actually rap it, but never let you down with stereo sound. Might get on the mic and tear it down. Turn it. I'm screwing up the lyrics, of course. But that's just piling on all of these different references. Everybody knows I'm known for dropping science. That's that iambic rhythm, but it flips it around. Might get on the mic. It flips it around. It syncopates that iambic rhythm or the march rhythm with the waltz rhythm or the anapestic rhythm. And so, if it was just purely one rhythm, it would, it would lull it would short circuit the audience's ability to really feel the visceral impact of that particular rhythm. And so they switch it up with, an anapestic rhythm to bring it back around. So yeah, I don't know how much I'm really going to talk about the Beastie Boys specifically. This is where I feel I fall short of just the appeal of the clickbait title. But I could talk plenty about the beat poetry. But the story is called "I'm That Kid in the Corner," which is from a line from Sure Shot. I'm that kid in the corner, all bleeped up, and I want to sound I'm gonna take a piece of the pie. Why not? I'm not quitting. Think I'm gonna change up my style just to fit in, which again is, the overarching meaning. You could certainly say it's the changing style of hip hop at the time. But a lot of the visceral impact of it is really just the rhythm of the words together. But the whole idea of the story, and I memorized really just the first 5 minutes of it, because I was doing it for this reading where all the pieces have to be 5 minutes. The whole story is still ongoing, but that's the sort of thing I was conscious of in reading it out loud, because reading a story out loud, it's hard for the audience to really to get the narrative part of it, to follow the plot, just the nature of oral readings. It's hard to really follow plots, especially like a 5-minute chunk of a much longer story. So I was trying to really emphasize, the rhythmic parts of it. So, hey baby. So, in doing that, in self-editing through the process of memorization, just being conscious of the common ideas of, the simplifications of best practices in prose, avoiding, thank you, there you go, things like passive voice and adverbs. And the value, I meant to mention this as well, the value of avoiding passive voice and adverbs is purely on the meaning level, in the sense that, if you think of the core, what have you been eating? Hold on. There you go. The core value of any sort of artwork being the visceral stimulation, And the process of the artistic act being the optimization of access to that stimulation. The reason why, and this is what is always missing, in these creative writing textbooks for me, I haven't read one yet that really quite gets it right. And the classes that I've had before that disseminate these cliches, they'll say, don't, you'll see all these listicles, and they'll say, don't use adverbs, use verbs instead, or whatever. Why is that a problem? And the problem is that they're stimulant dead. So they don't, a lot of the times, if you compare an adverb to a verb, it's stimulant dead. Or passive voice compared to active voice. It's more stimulus to active voice, stimulation from active voice than passive voice, just by its nature. It includes more dead words. A past participle includes more dead words than, your basic past tense. I was going versus I went, or whatever. I was hitting versus I hit, whichever one. So, there's some value to that. I'm not denying that. Just in any of these cliches, there's some basic value in it, but it's lacking in explanation of why they work. But another really essential thing that's missing from a lot of these explanations is the when to really choose to eliminate these stimulant dead words. What are the best practices there in eliminating stimulant dead words? And so a lot of the times it comes down to a choice between which one is more stimulating. Is it the meaning of the words being, not eliciting any sort of visceral response? There's no sense imagery behind them, for example. And sense imagery is more directly tied to visceral response. Whereas this, the more cerebral sort of stimulant dead words, can you eliminate those versus enhancing stimulation through sound? So it's something in oral storytelling where you're not going to be able to really effectively communicate the story. That really boils it down to which parts of the prose are going to be most stimulating. Parataxis imagery, a stimulating rhythm, stimulating percussive rhythm, or the meanings of the words and that sort of thing. So here's a bit of the story. This is called "I'm That Kid in the Corner." Doug Futterman decided in high school to become a Buddhist because he didn't have a lot going on. And there's that march rhythm. A lot of those words are more cerebrally abstract, so they're not necessarily going to stimulate based on the meaning, but the choice is to communicate this basic fact about the character and stimulate using the rhythm of the words instead of the meaning. He didn't have a lot going on. It's very cerebrally abstract, so each individual word is not. My dogs are barking at things. Each individual word is not stimulating, but the combination of the words, ideally. I don't know, whether or not this is a brand new story, so I don't know whether or not it actually works. But I'm just saying, theoretically, that's why I would choose a cerebral abstraction, because it's rhythmically stimulating. He didn't have a lot going on. He wanted a passionate belief system to give his life direction and meaning. At first he thought here's a very iambic part, or marchy part. At first he thought his life-defining gimmick would be knowing everything about drums. So I took at first he thought his life-defining gimmick, very marchy, would be knowing everything about drums, moving it into a very waltzy sort of rhythm. And it's getting into more sense imagery, it's sort of veering into more sense imagery. But the main choice there is for the rhythm, the syncopated rhythm, syncopated by my definition. Of course, I'm writing a story about, I just admitted I don't know anything about music, but I'm writing a story about a musician. But I think there's a lot of snare drums in Beastie Boys song, so that's kind of why the reference was there. There are a lot of flutes, so the other character is a flautist. At first he thought his life-defining gimmick would be knowing everything about drums, and he found out about Tibetan skull drums from a book about drumming his mother gave him. So, there's some emotional imagery just tied into that. We know a little bit about him as a character, just in oral storytelling. You're not going to be able to communicate a whole lot about a character. But we know a bit about a character he desires, self-definition. He has this relationship with his parents. His mother, wants to encourage him to drum, little things like that. You can communicate in oral storytelling. For a much longer story, or some where the audience is reading it instead of listening to it, you could flesh that sort of thing out. But in oral storytelling, the emphasis is on the rhythm, on the sound, whatever sort of imagery, like skull drums. I picked skull drums. That's not a Beastie Boys reference, but that's an evocative image. The idea of drumming on a skull or what have you. And consequently caught on to Buddhism as a Bible thing to believe in. And so, I like the choice of the word thing, for example. Thing is very abstract, Bible thing to believe in. I could have said a Bible belief system or something like that. It caught on to Buddhism as a viable religion. I could have chosen a lot of different words there. A Bible thing to believe in. And to believe in is passive voice, so it's not as stimulating as Doug believed in Buddhism, which is kind of rhythmic, but in that particular sentence structure, it also reflects the character, and that's a lot of times my defense of passive voice construction in a sentence, if you do it really conscientiously. If you choose passive voice construction to, explicitly reflect a character, my little boys will never stay standing. Hold on. That's if you choose passive voice construction to reflect a character, and Doug is a very passive character in many ways at the beginning, grows more active. That's a totally valid choice. But his mom and dad didn't have a religion to speak of, so he'd be converting from nothing to nothing. That's very, iambic, marchy sort of rhythm. He'd be converting from nothing to nothing. And then there's that participle, as I said. I edit conscientiously for participles, which is a bad addiction of mine. But he'd be converting from nothing to nothing. He'd convert from nothing to nothing is awkward, whereas he'd be converting from nothing to nothing. At least a different type of nothing, based on what little he knew about Buddhism. It keeps the rhythm. So, do I eliminate the participle, or do I maintain the more appealing rhythm in the context of a story I'm delivering orally? Based on what little he knew about Buddhism. And so, I do that repetition of the phrase, which is something that just in prose that you're reading is not the best thing to have. But in oral storytelling, and this is Maggie's tearing something up. If you hear tearing sounds, it is something that she's able to tear. Just a little cardboard box. But in the context of oral storytelling, what was I just talking about? I love having my animals as part of these videos, but I do get distracted so easily. And with oral storytelling, that's a real common thing. I mean, that's something that I'm fascinated by, is like epic epithets, the wine dark sea, stuff like that. Storytelling really rooted in oral storytelling tends to rely on some of these repeated phrases, which I'll do constantly. which is I realize in written form it is a problem, but it's something that I'm doing consciously, so it's something I'm choosing to do. What little he knew about Buddhism came from a flautist in the marching band named Mabel King. And I think especially like that march rhythm, the fact that he's a snare drum, he plays the snare drum, is another character reflection thing in the prose itself that I was very conscious of. Once it gets to Mabel King, it switches a bit more to the anapestic. But mainly when talking about Doug Futterman, it's much more of that iambic march rhythm. It gets to be more of a waltzy rhythm with the flautist, Mabel King. Mabel King knew everything about everything, and so it goes into that anapestic. Mabel King knew everything about everything, so Doug had no reason to doubt her. That middle part, I just in the oral storytelling, I re-edited a part where he's trying to flirt with her and it's failing, but Mabel King tells the story basically is Mabel King tells him all these entirely incorrect things about Buddhism, about it being able to transmute matter and things like that. So, and he grows. I mean, as the story develops, he grows to believe this, and it sort of affects his view of reality, and they start to transmute matter and things like that. But then her lesson is things like, let me see. Buddhists have the power to transmute. Oh, let's see. Buddhists have the power to endow plants with human faculties like speech. There you go. Endow plants with human faculties like speech by surfacing the homunculus buried deep in their vegetable hearts. And so it's more anapestic. Which, in this particular case, you could certainly justify that on a character level because one's a snare drum player and one's a flautist, but you don't even have to have that to really justify something like that. You could say one character is more flowy, so you have that more anapestic rhythm really reflecting that character, or not. I mean, it's totally it's you do it because it sounds good and you'll like it. And that is all the justification you need. That might be a good place to end it. That's all the justification you need. But that's, something Ginsberg would say. That's not the whole story, but that's just little examples from the story. That's something that I quote from Kerouac and Ginsberg all the time. But Kerouac would say, "You're a genius all the time," and I tell that to people. Whatever you enjoy. So like the clickbait title is something perfectly tailored to my taste that I would definitely click on. But he'd say you're a genius all the time, but that's really the only standard you need to go by. And that's one of the big problems with disseminating these cliches as universal. So saying adverbs are always bad, never use adverbs. What if you like adverbs? What if you like passive voice? It's totally fine. If it sounds good to you, it sounds good. That's all that really matters. So what should a creative writing teacher teach on that in that regard to prose? Having the flexibility, having the tools at your disposal in order to access the greatest capacity to access the greatest prose you're capable of doing. And Ginsberg, the line from Ginsberg is, I wrote for my own soul's ears and a few other ears. He wrote Howl just for his friends and just to satisfy this essential need within himself. And that's all you really need to do. And another topic that I'm not an expert in, and I pretend like I know something about, the behavioral economics, but the books that I was the Malcolm Gladwell and all these other books that I was binging earlier, the recommendation is 10,000 hours of practice, and that's become a cliche. So I would rather encourage 10,000 hours of practice in any form. As I said, I'm jealous of Whiplash. I was hoping my creative writing education would be more like Whiplash and Black Swan. 10,000 hours of practice in things like rhythm, being able to instinctively access the optimum rhythm in order to optimize the visceral stimulation, the very particular and subjective visceral stimulation you're aiming for. That's a much better practice than the outer rim. I explained a bit of the outer rim last video. The dualistic rationalization and false universalization of saying that adverbs are always bad and passive voice is always bad. That's just not true. Write for your own soul's ears. I'm getting into the aphoristic territory. One of my problems with creative writing education is it has, in my experience, reduced down to aphoristic false universals. But instead of relying on these aphoristic false universals, write for your own soul's ears and a few other ears, but the actual skill to train yourself into doing is to have the flexibility to achieve the visceral effect you're very particularly aiming for. So a story inspired by both the Beastie Boys and beat poetry, very particular to my own taste, but that's ultimately all I need to achieve, is something that sounds good to me. And if somebody else likes it, I'm that kid in the corner, it's brand new story, so who knows if anybody else likes it. I have no idea. Somebody else likes it, that's just an addition to the pure joy of achieving that sort of visceral stimulation through the process of creating and sharing the art form. I think that might be it, because I'm going to start rambling. Say goodnight, Maggie. Maggie and Siku right down here. Say goodnight, Maggie. Say goodnight, Siku. See you next time.